I was ecstatic when it was revealed that the long-awaited Darksiders 3 was actually happening. I picked it up on launch day for Xbox One, and despite its somewhat rough release state, I deeply enjoyed my time with it. I played it again on Xbox Series X this year, where the significant upgrade was able to brute force through any lingering technical issues. But when a Switch version was announced, I couldn't help but think back to its original Xbox One release. If it took an Xbox Series X to solve its technical issues, then what hope was there for a Switch version? And yet, I had enjoyed it on Xbox One back in 2018, warts and all. So if the Switch version could just get close enough, perhaps there was hope. Darksiders 3, much like Darksiders 2, takes place during a time skip that occurs just after the opening segment of the original Darksiders. The Horsemen of the Apocalypse War has ridden early, causing the armies of heaven and hell to descend upon the earth. As he sits in chains awaiting judgment for his actions, which will ultimately come in the form of a Zelda-inspired adventure game, his sister Fury is tasked with hunting down the 7 deadly sins who are loose on Earth. Unlike the first Darksiders, which takes place largely 1,000 years after the apocalypse, and Darksiders 2, which predominantly focuses on universes outside our own, Darksiders 3 takes place on an immediately post-apocalyptic Earth. Angels and demons fight to carve out territory, and a few human survivors cling to life. Earth in transition ultimately forms the backdrop for what is probably the most character-driven story the series has told.
I see you have procured the Flame Hollow. How much for it?
You're kidding.
I am. Look at you, learning to identify humor. That's character growth.
Unlike the 2 previously explored horsemen, Fury isn't attempting to atone for or undo the apocalypse. In fact, she'd much rather join in. The story is ultimately one of understanding what makes humanity unique and worth saving via an exploration of their failures. And then, of course, you also kill a literal tornado by setting it on fire at one point. This is still a Darksiders game, after all. The Darksiders series has long been heavily inspired by 3D Zelda, but with a greater focus on combat. For Darksiders 3, the series makes a shift toward more strategic combat, taking heavy influence from the Souls franchise. Players can choose between 2 combat modes. The default lines up more closely with this inspiration. Healing items take a moment to use and require Fury to stop moving. Attacks cannot be interrupted with other actions, such as dodges, requiring the player to fully commit to any given action. Classic mode, on the other hand, allows combat to feel a little bit more like the previous 2 Darksiders games by reversing the 2 aforementioned restrictions. That being said, difficulty is maintained across both. This is by far the most difficult game in the series when it comes to combat. It is very easy to be overwhelmed by a few enemies if you aren't watching them carefully, and many of the bosses provide a stiff challenge. Combat is only part of the journey, however. The rest of Darksiders 3 is focused on exploration and some light puzzle solving. In comparison to the previous games, the focus on bespoke Zelda-like dungeons is reduced, and much of the puzzle solving revolves more around using acquired abilities to access previously unavailable parts of the environment. In this way, I'd compare Darksiders 3 less with Zelda or even Dark Souls, and more with Metroid. Over the course of the adventure, Fury will acquire various upgrades called Hollows. These abilities will allow her to take on different elemental forms that each grant her new movement options. One allows her a triple jump that rockets her into the air. Another allows her to walk normally at full speed while underwater. Yet another allows her to walk on top of water instead. One even gives her the ability to take on the form of a ball and attach to certain parts of walls and ceilings. The comparisons to Metroid are not hard to find or obscured. In fact, the ability that lets her walk normally underwater even turns her purple, just like Metroid. Once again, these influences are clear and are not shied away from. When it comes to game design, I have very few complaints about Darksiders 3. The one glaring issue, made only more evident by the comparisons I just mentioned, is the lack of a map. The world of Darksiders 3 is one of the most labyrinthian I have ever seen. It's huge, seamless, interconnected, and oftentimes very confusing. You do have a compass that points you generally in the direction of the next major objective, but going back with new abilities to clear out optional side areas is a huge chore. You can fast travel from any of the checkpoints that also serve as shops throughout the world, but the fast travel points are merely presented as a list, separated only by generally themed areas. Despite playing through this game multiple times at this point, I've never gotten a good hold on the layout of the world. If you're just in it to push through the main storyline, it isn't the biggest issue, but this is clearly a game that wants you to explore, find collectibles, and even take on optional bosses. The absence of even the most basic map system, which has been present in every other Darksiders game, is baffling. The Switch version itself is an odd beast to critique. Even now, returning to the Xbox One version years after its launch and multiple patches, it still has issues. It regularly pauses to stream in more of the world if you're moving too quickly through it. Aggressive geometry culling means that turning the camera too quickly almost always reveals a quick glimpse of the void on your peripherals, and the loading times after death generally range from 30 to 40 seconds. The Switch version maintains all of these issues, but at the same time, doesn't really add to them. In fact, on average, loading times are about 15 to 20% faster on Switch. The general technical impression is that outside of visual changes made to get it running on the system, this is largely on par with that Xbox One version. This is not to say that it is good from a technical perspective, merely that the issues present are not inherent to this port. In terms of raw visuals, Darksiders 3 makes a lot of cuts, but as a result maintains a reasonable frame rate and a decent resolution. Playing handheld, it actually looks quite good. Things are a bit blurrier on the TV, but not as bad as I'd have expected. If you're interested, I'll link my full technical breakdown at the end of the video. Darksiders 3 is a more challenging take on a series that wasn't exactly known for being easy in the first place. It changes up its influences somewhat while maintaining its unique take on action-adventure. Outside of the obvious omission of a map, the simple act of playing Darksiders 3 is fun, challenging, and rewarding. The Switch port, save for the expected visual downgrades, is on par with the originally targeted systems. The only problem is that it never ran particularly well on those systems either. If anything, the Switch version actually improves on some elements of the original performance, but it can be a bit of a rough ride. This was always a game that required more powerful hardware to push through its shortcomings, and the Switch obviously can't really deliver on that. At the same time, with slightly faster loading times and solid handheld performance, I'd probably still take this over going back to the original Xbox One version. This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.